Hey girls, welcome to our last week together as we have taken the opportunity to study through the book None Like Him, written by author Jen Wilkin. We're looking here today at chapter 10, God's Sovereignty. One of the things that Jen brings out in God's sovereignty that I really appreciated was having taken our time discovering the multi-layered perfections of God, we are at last ready to see Him crowned and ruling, as we might not have been at the beginning. We are ready to meditate on His sovereignty. The idea of God's infinite rule is not only difficult to grasp, it is difficult to trust unless we have first spent time considering other aspects of His nature. And I think this is very true. Something I want to draw out here for you, though, is Jen, in talking about saving the best for last, she is not making some type of argument as if God's sovereignty is the most important attribute of God. Something I want you to understand is that God does not have an attribute that's more important than another. God is all of these attributes at all times, for all times, and He is all of them equally. And this isn't a 50-50 equality. This is a 100%, 100%, 100%, 100%, and so forth. He is equally each of these attributes in full, at all times, for all times. All right? So when she's drawing this emphasis out, when she's saying she's saving the best for last, the emphasis is ours in our human minds. This is something that is so important to us as people, is ruling, right? Because we've had a lot of rulers, and our world is made up of people who rule. And so the emphasis is ours. God does not put that emphasis on it. His attributes are all equally important. And if you look at what she's saying here, she is talking about how that emphasis is on ours. She says, we are at last ready to see Him crowned. That we might have not been able to do that from the beginning. And that this infinite rule is difficult to grasp, difficult to trust, unless we have first spent time considering the other aspects. And so she's not making an argument that this is the most important attribute. She's making an argument that we people, that this is going to be a very difficult attribute to grasp unless we have taken the time to look at the other one. So the emphasis is on our shortcoming, on our ability to see attributes correctly. And so that's why she's written them in the order that she's written them in. I want to draw this point out a little bit more because I think it's a point well worth making. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 6, verse 1, Isaiah is in the throne room of God, and he sees Him seated on the throne, and it says His throne, the train of His robe, filled the whole temple. Okay? Something interesting about in kingdom living is that the length of train on a king's robe would indicate his authority. It would indicate perhaps how much land he owned or how many people he was in authority over. This would be a significant display of how important he really was, how good of a king he really was. And so when you walked into the throne room and you saw that his train was really little, you'd be like, well, this guy isn't very impressive at all, is he? One of the things that kings would do in battle times, when one king would defeat another king, is that he would take the train of his robe and he would strip it from him. And it's this visual that he is literally stripping him of his authority, of his importance, of his significance. But then what he would do is he would take the train of that king's robe and he would sew it on to his own train. And so what you would see then is perhaps the length of his train was already very large, but now he is showing you this dominance that he has by adding on this additional train from another king. And he's saying, this was my authority, and now I have taken this guy's authority, and look how important I am. Look how much power I possess. Now I have his land. Now I have his people. And so as a king would go around and conquer all of these different lands, he's stripping the authority from all of these other kings, and he is adding it on to his own train. If you walked into this guy's throne room and you saw him wearing this robe, and you saw this train, and you saw all of these additional fabrics from other kings on here, your knees would start knocking. This guy knows how to take down kingdoms. He is in power over a lot of land, over a lot of people. His rule is significant. It is impressive. And you would be like, ugh. Isaiah says that when he saw God seated on the throne, his train filled the whole temple. There's an aspect of this where I think it would be right for us to see this picture, that God is a King of kings. The Lord even tells us in Scripture that one day kings and kingdoms will bow down to him. So there's this idea, yes, truly biblically, where God is stripping the authority from every other king, and he is adding it to the train of his own robe, thus showing his dominance, his authority, his rule, the King of all kings. But the point that I want to draw out today is different than that picture. You see, the train of God's robe can fill a temple all by itself. God's authority does not come because he has stripped it and inherited it from other kings that he has dominated over. His train is the length that it is simply because of the king that he is. Here's a different picture. Remember back at prom when you voted for a king and a queen, prom king and prom queen? How were these things decided? First of all, you voted on it. Secondly, you were voting on the character. Maybe not the character like that the person was the nicest or the most valuable person on the planet, but perhaps the voting was more like who was the best looking, or who had the most friends, or who was the best athlete, and what particular sport was he or she the athlete in. Maybe this was based on how many functions and teams and activities was this person a part of. And so it was based on these attributes, these characters, these qualities that a person might possess. And so people would vote for him or her, and she would become king or queen. Again, this analogy falls short in describing God as the king. You see, we don't vote for God to be the best king of them all. And God doesn't deserve to be king because he is the most popular or because he is the most talented at something. God, in his sovereignty, isn't sovereign because of anything outside of himself. You see, even this word sovereignty means independent power. It is a supreme. We understand the idea of supreme, but it's an independent power. I looked up the word sovereignty on Wikipedia. I know, don't judge me, but I looked up the word sovereignty on Wikipedia. Here's something interesting that they pointed out. God is the sovereign Lord of all by an incontestable right as the creator, the owner, the possessor of heaven and earth. I want to read that again, and I want you to really embrace the emphasis that I'm creating. God is the sovereign Lord of all by an incontestable right as the creator, the owner, the possessor of heaven. You see, just like the analogy falls short that he has stripped other kings of their kingdoms and has added them to himself. Just like the analogy of voting for a king and queen based on how wonderful of a person that they are. Or even the illustration where a prince inherits his kingdom. He's not voted in either. And certainly we know this to be true, that a lot of kings that sat on the throne were terrible men. And mostly they got to be that king simply because it was the birth order. It was their right only because of an inheritance. Again, that analogy falls short. God did not inherit his kingdom from something else. He did not acquire it from other kingdoms, and it wasn't given to him because he was just the best guy for the job. But he has an incontestable right as and because he is the creator. You see, these things are not given to him. He is not the authority based on other things. He is the authority, period. And out of his authority, he has created these things. Does that make sense? Do you see that perspective shift? You see, we don't save sovereignty as the best for last, as if all these other attributes lead up to this final moment. Oh, his sovereignty, it's so amazing. No, see, he's sovereign. He's God. He's the creator. He's the owner. He's the possessor, period. And then how he rules, how all these things come out is because he's the ruler. He rules as these other attributes. Again, I don't want to put an emphasis on one attribute over another. That's a very human thing to do. These attributes are all equal in importance. But if I could use this perspective to illustrate the point that I'm trying to make. I remember when I was probably about 4th or 5th grade, I inherited a whole heap of Barbie dolls, of Barbie doll homes, of clothes, shoes, accessories, animals. I mean, it was the works. And so I had my own place. The basement was refinished. I had my own place where I could spread these dolls out. I had like homes everywhere for them. And of course, I utilized other things like couch pillows or cushions where I made homes and so forth. And so I would live in this world of Barbie doll. Okay. Here's the thing about my mind. I am a huge sucker for romantic comedies. If there is kissing in a movie, 2 thumbs up. If you get to the end of the movie and boy has met girl and boy did not kiss girl, what a pathetic ending. I didn't like it at all. I don't care if the acting is good. In fact, the worse the acting is, the better it is for me. I don't care if it's about Christmas. I don't care if they went back to a farm. I don't care. I just don't care about the plot. If there's kissing, I'm in. I love romantic comedies. And so as I would play with these Barbie dolls, guess what I acted out? A rom-com. That's how I did it. And so these girls would dress up in certain ways and they'd go on certain days with the certain Ken doll that I had designated, and they rode on a horse or they rode in a car and they went to a restaurant or they went to a park, and at the end of the date, oh, he says the right things and she's wearing the right things and her hair's the right way and he's so suave and kind and wonderful, and then they kiss in the moonlight or they kiss in the sunset or whatever, they're kissing, right? Why did these Barbie dolls enact this way? Because I was the one that was ruling over them. Now, the illustration falls short in this sense that I didn't obviously create these Barbie dolls, but they are created beings and they move and operate based on what I want them to do. And I want them to enact a romantic comedy. Interestingly enough, as I have had the opportunity to watch the difference in my daughters and my son play with dolls, is that my daughters operate their dolls a whole lot similar to the way I did. But my son given the opportunity to play Barbie dolls, he probably would play with the dolls, but he wouldn't play with them anywhere near the way I would play with them. You see, the way he would play with Barbie dolls would be like an action adventure movie. He would have things that were guns and he's mowing everybody else down, or maybe they're in fist fights or they're in kickboxing fights. And the way he even plays with his own dinosaurs and his trucks is that one is always beating another one up, and he declares a winner and he declares a loser. How would yours be? Let's say you're playing with dolls. What would your movie title be? Would it be a thriller, a suspense? Are you into those horrific, gory type movies? Are you into mystery solving? Who done it? And you want to know who done it. How would you orchestrate that? You see, how you would play with those dolls, how you orchestrate their movement is born out of who you are as the person playing. Now, obviously, again, the illustration falls short. God isn't up in heaven just playing dolls. But he is moving us and orchestrating us, designing us into how we interact with one another, what we do and where we go and who we're with and how it affects a person, or how it doesn't affect a person, how it affects us. What time frame are we living in? The 1700s, the 1800s, the early 2000s? See, God is orchestrating all of this. Fortunately, God isn't having us going around enacting a romantic comedy. He doesn't have us going around enacting an action and adventure movie or a thriller or a mystery or suspense. You see, God orchestrates out of who he is. Do you understand the point that I'm making? The emphasis that Jen has created here, that it's hard to grasp an idea of a God's infinite rule, and it's difficult to trust him unless we have first spent time considering the other aspects of his nature. If the Barbie dolls had an opportunity to think, and if they had an opportunity to respond to what I was having them do, how I was having them play, maybe they'd be like, why are we doing so much kissing? This is really ridiculous. With Henry, they might say, why are we always fighting? Why are we so mad all the time? What would it be for your movie? What would your dolls say to you? Seeing with God being the orchestrator of all of our lives, when we look at him, the way things are enacting in our life is him as the creator and the orchestrator, and it's born out of who he is. Then when we look at him and we look at who he is, what we see is that he is a good God. He is an immutable God. He is a faithful God. He is an omniscient God, an omnipotent God. He is he is a God who loves, full of grace, forgiveness, and mercy. You see, God is the sovereign Lord of all, and by an incontestable right as the creator. This is why he is the authority. But then also, listen, I want to bring these 2 points together in tandem. God's attributes do not make him worthy of authority. His authority just is. But his character deems him a good ruler. I feel like I'm all over the map with these analogies, and I'm trying to bring this point home. That initial point, that God isn't sovereign because he has grabbed it from all of these other places. He just is sovereign. And then as I'm enacting out the Barbie doll play, it's based on who I am. And the Barbie dolls would have a right to suspect that I'm not the best person for the job to have their worlds manage and operate. They definitely have a right to be concerned as my son would operate them. But as God ordains and operates our lives, there is nothing of his character that we would have a right to look at him and say, this is really in question for me. I wish you would do it this way instead of the other way. Because really, what I don't like about you is the way you always emphasize this in my life, or the way this is always going down in my life, or how you've had this situation in my life. You see, we don't have that right. When we look at God for who he really is, and we watch how he orchestrates things in our lives and how he even ebbs and flows us through life, if we truly see him for who he is, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, immutable, eternal, if we're looking at him in this right perspective, then we recognize his sovereignty is spot on. He's a good ruler. And we don't let him rule us because he's a good guy. He just is the ruler because he's the creator. He has that incontestable right. And how he rules is good through his character. Wow, that's still falling short. I still feel like my words cannot express that adequately. I hope I am not just making everybody miserable with confusion. But really, it is this point. God's attributes, let's look at them here real quickly. God's attributes, his incomprehensibility, his self-existence, his self-sufficiency, his eternality, his immutability, his omnipresence, omniscience, his omnipotence. These attributes do not make him worthy of his sovereignty. These characters don't build up and make him capable of ruling. They don't make him the most well voted for king. He hasn't stripped all of these things from anybody else. These aren't inherited things. His authority is not by anything else. God's attributes do not make him worthy of his authority. His authority just is. Period. Because he has an incontestable right as the creator. It just is. But here's the relief that we can have. Here's where that difficulty to grasp, that difficulty to trust, this is where this can be relieved. Because as we spent time looking at these other characters, what we recognize is that God's character is good. And so therefore, he is a good ruler. I am praying, even as I am speaking, that this good ruler can take this jarble of words and this Rolodex of analogies, and be able to use his spirit in you to pierce you with the point that I am making. Because this is very important. It is a very important point that we don't just see God as a ruler because, well, he's good at it, or we voted him in, or that he stripped it from somebody else, or that he inherited it. We need to understand that God's authority only comes because he is. And then we can trust that authority. We can be relieved by his sovereignty, not fearful of what our situation is, not angry because he created us wrong, but look at him as a good ruler, trusting his sovereignty because of all of these other attributes. Our Lord is an amazing Lord. I hope this book really has fine-tuned your vision on who God is. I hope that it has brought out a conviction and a challenge that our daily lives are focused too much on ourselves. That we look at God as if He should do things our way, instead of looking at who God is and saying, I trust you to do it your way. This study has been excellent. I hope that you take the opportunity at some point in life to read it again, because it's a book well worth reading again. Or maybe you'd like to look at some of the other books written about the attributes of God that Jen even mentions in the beginning of her book. Maybe you would take the opportunity to go back through the book and look at these different attributes and see for yourself. Pull out a concordance, get some kind of a Bible app on your phone, and check out these attributes for yourself and do your own study on these attributes of God and see what Scripture has to say for itself about who God is. Taking the time to know more is always worth the effort, always worth the struggle, because it will be a struggle. You won't understand all of it. But it is time well worth spent. It is time, well, it is time spent well. How about I say it that way? At any rate, this has been a great study, and I'm honored and humbled to have been a part of it. Girls, there is one final note in the very back of the book, and that is Jen's conclusion on Fearful and Wonderful. We will not take the time to do a video on that, but I did want to encourage you to read it because it is a valid point that she makes. And I think all of it, in conclusion, draws us right back to where the focus should be, on God, on who He is. That's where the emphasis really needs to be. Girls, I'm praying for you. I'm excited for you over the things that you have learned. I'm challenging you to study it further, to do more, to do the book again. And I'm encouraging you to encourage others with the things that you have been encouraged with. It's been fun. You girls, have a good rest of the week.